He clawed his way up from the gutter with a rifle in his hand and a chip on his shoulder the size of Wellington's army. Sharpe didn't just fight the French. He fought the studios, the weather, the politics, and a casting disaster that almost ended everything before a single musket fired. These are 20 dark facts about Sharpe. And the bonus? The one thing the production feared more than Napoleon's cavalry was already buried in the ground beneath their feet. The Fix Your Shako. This one gets brutal fast. Number 1. The man who was supposed to be Sharpe never fired a single shot in anger. Before Sean Bean ever pulled on that battered green jacket, the role belonged to someone else entirely. Paul McGann, a respected British actor with serious dramatic range and a face that could carry a period epic, had been cast, rehearsed, and was already on the ground in the Crimea, Ukraine, ready to bring Richard Sharpe to life. Then day 1 of filming arrived, and everything collapsed in an instant. During an early rehearsal involving horses, McGann fell and shattered his leg. Not a sprain, not a bruise. A clean, catastrophic break that ended his involvement immediately. The production was thousands of miles from home, deep in post-Soviet Ukraine, with a crew assembled and a schedule that couldn't wait. Central Television didn't panic slowly. They panicked fast, made calls faster, and landed on one name, Sean Bean, a Yorkshire actor who had been working steadily but hadn't yet broken through to leading man status. He flew out with almost no preparation, no writing rehearsal, and no real time to find the character before the cameras rolled. And yet, from the first moment he appeared on screen, dirty, dangerous, and barely contained, nobody ever questioned it. McGann's injury was a disaster, but what came out of it was something the scripts alone couldn't have manufactured. Sharpe became Sean Bean, and Sean Bean became Sharpe. And that was simply that.
Prove of my raising an officer from the ranks.
Number 2. Before there was a television series, there was a man sitting alone and completely broke, trying to write his way out of financial ruin. Bernard Cornwell didn't create Richard Sharpe because he had a grand artistic vision or a burning desire to rewrite Napoleonic history. He created him because he needed money, urgently, and he needed a book that would sell. It was the early 1980s, and Cornwell had left a BBC job to follow his American wife to the United States, only to discover that his work permit wasn't coming. Trapped, frustrated, and burning through savings he didn't really have, he sat down and wrote a novel about a soldier who started with nothing and fought for everything. Cornwell later said he modeled Sharpe's relentless upward drive partly on his own desperation. A man who couldn't go back, couldn't stand still, and had to keep moving forward or be crushed. The original Sharpe was written in a white heat of financial panic, hammered out quickly, with real fury underneath the adventure. Cornwell imagined him as tall, blonde, and vaguely aristocratic in bearing despite his rough origins, almost nothing like the compact, dark-eyed Sean Bean, who would eventually embody the character on screen. The novel sold. Then another sold, then another. By the time ITV came knocking to adapt the series, Cornwell had built an empire from that original act of desperation. Sharpe was born in poverty, fictional and real, and somehow that desperation baked itself into every page. Number 3. The Crimea in the early 1990s was not a safe place to make a television program, and the production knew it before they arrived and went anyway. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, and what replaced it in Ukraine was a country struggling through political chaos, economic collapse, and a military that was rapidly losing structure and discipline. When the Sharpe production landed in the Crimea, chosen because its landscape convincingly doubled for the Iberian Peninsula, they arrived into an environment that was genuinely unpredictable. Local officials needed to be navigated carefully. Resources that had been promised sometimes failed to materialize. Vast numbers of Ukrainian military extras were available because the newly independent country had inherited enormous Soviet forces and had very little budget to pay them. That part worked, but the surrounding instability did not make for easy filming. Crew members reported unease operating in regions where authority was unclear and where the line between official permission and personal arrangement was blurry at best. Supplies were unreliable. Communications were difficult. and the sheer remoteness of some locations meant that if something went wrong, medically, logistically, or politically, help wasn't close. The production pushed through because the locations were extraordinary, and the budget couldn't afford anything better. What looks on screen like sweeping, dusty Iberian countryside was actually a crumbling post-Soviet landscape filmed by a British crew holding their nerve in a country that was still figuring out what it was. The chaos of the setting seeped into the production, and somehow, it made the whole thing feel more real. Number 4. Beneath the ground where the cast and crew walked, filmed, and staged their elaborate battle scenes, there were things left over from a different war entirely. The Crimean Peninsula had been a battlefield twice over. Once in the 1850s, which the Sharpe series dramatized in later installments, and again with devastating totality during World War II, when the region saw some of the most brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. Sevastopol had been besieged, bombed, and fought over with a ferocity that left the landscape permanently scarred. By the time the Sharpe production arrived in the early 1990s, unexploded ordnance from that Second World War conflict was still a documented reality in parts of the peninsula. Not everywhere, and not in quantities that caused daily alarm, but the knowledge was there, quietly present in the background. Production staff were warned. Local guides who knew the terrain were consulted. Certain areas were simply off limits, not for dramatic reasons, but for safety ones. For a production already dealing with real horses, real explosions, and a cast doing far too many of their own physical scenes, the idea that the ground itself might be hazardous added a layer of genuine danger that no amount of risk assessment could fully neutralize. Sean Bean later spoke about the filming conditions in Ukraine with a mixture of pride and disbelief. They got it done. They always got it done. But the Crimea wasn't just a dramatic backdrop borrowed for television. It was a landscape with its own dark history, and that history was still literally buried just below the surface. Number 5. Sean Bean is famous across decades of film and television for one specific thing: dying. Ned Stark, Boromir, GoldenEye. The list is long, the memes are endless, and the pattern is so consistent, it feels almost deliberate. But Sharpe broke that pattern completely, and it did so across 16 television films spanning more than a decade. Sharpe didn't die. He survived everything. French cavalry, treacherous officers, ambushes, near executions, and personal betrayals that would have finished a lesser man in the first episode. And that survival carried its own particular weight for Sean Bean, because Sharpe was the role that made him. Before GoldenEye, before The Lord of the Rings, before Game of Thrones, there was Sharpe. It was Sharpe that proved Bean could carry a drama entirely on his shoulders for 90 minutes at a time. It was Sharpe that showed he had the physical presence and the emotional complexity to make a morally ambiguous hero genuinely compelling. And yet, it is almost never the role people reach for when they talk about his legacy, because Sharpe survived and the others didn't. And somehow the deaths lodge deeper in the cultural memory. Bean has spoken about how much the character meant to him, personally, professionally, as a kind of foundation. Sharpe was the one who lived, and in a filmography haunted by noble sacrifice and dramatic last stands, that survival might be the darkest, strangest fact of all. The character who should have defined him is the one history half forgot because he refused to fall. Number 6. The battle scenes in Sharpe look expensive. They shouldn't. The production budget was tight by any standard, and genuinely punishing by the standard of what the show was trying to achieve. Large-scale Napoleonic warfare, cavalry charges, musket volleys, cannon fire, and hundreds of extras moving in coordinated period-accurate formations across open terrain. What made it possible was the Ukrainian military. In the early 1990s, the newly independent Ukrainian state had inherited vast numbers of Soviet troops, and an immediate problem: it couldn't pay them properly. When the Sharpe production arrived and offered work as extras, the response was significant. Soldiers showed up in numbers. They could march in formation because they actually knew how to march in formation. They could handle the physical demands of a shoot because they were trained for physical demands. They brought with them a discipline and a convincing mass that no amount of hired civilian extras could have replicated, particularly not on a British television budget. But working with real military forces in a politically unstable country came with complications. Communication required layers of translation. Orders given on set sometimes filtered through military command structures before reaching the men actually doing the work. And the soldiers had their own sense of dignity and hierarchy that the production had to respect. What looked on screen like Wellington's Redcoats was, in reality, a post-Soviet military force moonlighting for a British television drama, making the whole thing work through sheer practical necessity. Number 7. The horses nearly ended the production before the stories could. From day one, literally given what happened to Paul McGann, horses were a source of danger and disruption that ran through the entire series like a low current of controlled catastrophe. The terrain in Ukraine was rough, uneven, and largely unmapped by anyone thinking about horse safety. Animals brought to locations that were unfamiliar, surrounded by pyrotechnics, camera equipment, crowds of extras, and the general chaos of a working film set, became unpredictable in ways that no amount of preparation could fully prevent. Sean Bean himself was not an experienced rider when the series began. He learned fast, out of necessity, and by most accounts threw himself into the physical demands of the role with the kind of reckless commitment that made the stunts look real because they frequently were. Other cast members had varying degrees of experience. The stunt coordination was professional, but the conditions were not controlled in the way a studio environment or a well-resourced film set might have been. Falls happened, near misses happened. The production pressed on because it had no real alternative. Sharpe without horses is barely sharp at all, and the battle scenes that gave the series its scale and spectacle depended entirely on those animals cooperating with a production that was asking a great deal of them in genuinely difficult conditions. Every cavalry charge that made it to screen carried the invisible weight of everything that almost went wrong just off camera. Number 8. The woman who helped hold the first Sharpe films together behind the scenes was working inside a system that didn't make things easy for her, and she did it anyway. Producer Muir Sutherland navigated a production environment that was genuinely hostile to the kind of television Sharpe was trying to be. British television in the early 1990s was cautious about period drama on this scale. The budget arguments were constant. The location choices were questioned. Bringing a crew to post-Soviet Ukraine was not something the institutional machinery of British television embraced with enthusiasm. It was something that had to be argued for, justified, fought for meeting by meeting. The logistical challenges of operating in a country with unreliable infrastructure, language barriers, and a political climate that was shifting underfoot required a kind of relentless practical problem-solving that never showed up on screen but made everything on screen possible. When supplies didn't arrive, alternatives had to be found. When permissions became complicated, relationships had to be built quickly with local authorities who had their own priorities. When cast members were injured or equipment failed in the field, solutions had to come from the people already there because there was no rapid response support system waiting back home. The Sharpe series has been celebrated for Sean Bean's performance and Bernard Cornwell's stories, and rightly so. But the dark, grinding, unglamorous work of keeping a production like this alive in conditions like those rarely gets the recognition it deserves. It was a logistical war running parallel to the fictional one, and it was won the same way Sharpe always won, through sheer refusal to quit. The character of Richard Sharpe carried within him a darkness that went well beyond the standard heroic template, and that darkness had personal roots for Bernard Cornwell that the television series only partially surfaced. Cornwell was adopted as a child and spent years of his adult life trying to locate his biological family. When he finally found them, the experience was complicated and painful in ways he has spoken about openly. The search for identity, for legitimacy, for a place in a world that doesn't automatically offer you one. These are Sharpe's defining obsessions, translated into a Napoleonic military context, but rooted in something very real. Sharpe is a man born to nothing, given a name by no one in particular, rising through a system designed to keep him exactly where he started. His rage is never entirely explained by the plot. It runs deeper than any single enemy or injustice, and it never fully goes away even when he wins. Cornwell essentially wrote his own wound into this character and then sent him to war with it. The television series caught this quality in Bean's performance in ways that the production perhaps didn't fully strategize. Bean brought a genuine working-class Yorkshire intensity to the role that connected with Cornwell's emotional blueprint without anyone needing to explain it. Sharpe's darkness wasn't dramatic technique. It was autobiography wearing a green jacket, and that's why it hit differently from every other period adventure hero on British television at the time. The later Sharpe films almost didn't happen, and the gap in the middle of the series tells a story the official histories tend to gloss over. After the initial run of films in the early 1990s, the production stalled. The reasons were multiple and interconnected: shifting television priorities, questions about budget and audience numbers, and the fact that Sean Bean had become, in the intervening years, considerably more famous and considerably more expensive. GoldenEye came out in 1995. The Lord of the Rings was on the horizon. The actor who had made Sharpe possible was no longer the hungry, relatively unknown talent who had flown out to Ukraine to replace an injured colleague at almost no notice. He was a genuine star, and genuine stars cost money that a period television drama budget struggles to accommodate. Negotiations were difficult. There were periods when it seemed genuinely possible that Sharpe would simply end without resolution, with the character left suspended mid-story and the remaining novels unfilmed. Bean reportedly remained committed to returning. Sharpe was his foundation, and he hadn't forgotten it. But commitment alone doesn't close a budget gap. The series did return eventually and continued sporadically into the 2000s. But the gap between the early run and the later films was longer and harder than most viewers realized, and it came disturbingly close to being permanent. The show that made Sean Bean almost died because Sean Bean became too good at his job. That particular irony would have made Sharpe himself laugh, once, bitterly, before moving on. The green jacket itself deserves its own dark biography. The costume that became one of British television's most recognizable garments was not carefully preserved between shoots. It was deliberately aged, beaten, stained, and abused to maintain the continuity of a man who lives in the field and never quite escapes it. Costume designers worked to make the jacket look like it had survived actual warfare, because Sharpe's entire identity depended on that credibility. A clean, well-pressed rifleman's jacket would have destroyed the character instantly. But the process of controlled destruction created practical problems across a long-running series, matching the exact degree of wear from film to film, ensuring the damage looked earned rather than theatrical, and doing all of it on a budget that didn't accommodate luxury. Multiple versions existed simultaneously. Some were kept in better condition for close-up work. Others were sacrificed entirely to action sequences. Bean wore them through mud, rain, and pyrotechnic smoke across a decade of filming. The jacket became a character in its own right, a visual shorthand for everything Sharpe was and everything he'd survived.
But mark my words, he'll bring us back.
Number 12. One episode came dangerously close to being pulled from broadcast entirely because of its violence. The Sharpe series always understood that Napoleonic warfare was not clean or romantic, and it committed to showing the consequences of musket fire and bayonet combat with a directness that occasionally made network executives deeply uncomfortable. A particular sequence, involving the aftermath of a siege and the treatment of prisoners, was edited multiple times before it reached transmission. The original cut was considered too graphic for the intended broadcast slot. Notes came back, cuts were made, then further cuts were requested. The creative team pushed back, arguing that sanitizing the violence would undermine the entire moral architecture of the story, that Sharpe's world only meant something if the audience understood what was actually at stake in it. A compromise was eventually reached, but the episode that aired was shorter and softer than the version the director had delivered. Somewhere, the original cut exists. Whether it will ever be seen remains genuinely unclear. Number 13. Pete Postlethwaite appeared in the series and delivered, as he always did, something that transcended the material around him. But what the production didn't advertise was how difficult the conditions were for the supporting cast, who received none of the logistical consideration that the lead and key crew members were given. Actors flying into Ukraine for guest roles arrived into an environment that was disorienting, physically uncomfortable, and operationally chaotic in ways nobody had fully prepared them for. Accommodation was basic, transport was unreliable, the language barrier created isolation that went beyond professional inconvenience. Several guest cast members have spoken in interviews about arriving expecting a challenging but manageable location shoot and finding something considerably harder. The catering, the facilities, the communication, all of it operated at a level that would have been considered unacceptable on a comparable British production at home. Most endured it without complaint because the work was good and Sean Bean made the environment feel worth tolerating. But the gap between what the series looked like on screen and what it felt like to make it was vast and largely invisible to the audience watching comfortably at home. Number 14. Director Tom Clegg helmed the majority of the early Sharpe films and carried a burden that rarely gets acknowledged. He was not simply directing a period drama. He was managing a production in a foreign country, with military extras who required separate handling, a lead actor still finding his feet on horseback, weather that changed without warning, and a schedule so tight that the margin for anything going wrong was essentially zero. There were days on the Ukrainian locations when Clegg had to make decisions in real time that would have required committee approval back home, whether to push through deteriorating weather, whether to keep filming after a near-miss incident, whether to sacrifice a planned sequence because the light or the terrain or the mood of the military extras made it impossible. He kept those decisions largely to himself and kept the production moving. The films that resulted feel confident, propulsive, and visually coherent, qualities that disguise completely how close to the edge the whole operation was running. Clegg never made headlines. The show did. That imbalance is its own particular injustice. Number 15. The relationship between Sean Bean and the character of Richard Sharpe crossed from professional into something closer to psychological during the long run of the series. Bean has spoken carefully but openly about how much of himself he poured into Sharpe. The outsider identity, the working class pride, the distrust of authority dressed up in fine clothes. Bean grew up in Sheffield, the son of a welder, and worked his way through drama school and early television roles with the particular hunger of someone who knows exactly how easily the door can close again. Sharpe's contempt for aristocratic officers who inherited their rank and spent their soldiers' lives carelessly was not something Bean had to manufacture. It came from somewhere real. And across 16 films spanning more than a decade, maintaining that emotional authenticity while the world around him changed. While he became famous, wealthy, and professionally secure, required a discipline that was invisible on screen precisely because it worked. He kept going back to Sharpe. He kept finding him. That loyalty to a character born in someone else's financial desperation says something about Bean that his more celebrated roles, the ones that killed him spectacularly, somehow don't. Number 16. The series never received the awards recognition it deserved, and that omission is darker than it first appears. British television in the 1990s had a clear hierarchy, and prestige period drama meant something very specific. Drawing rooms, measured dialogue, interior suffering rendered in candlelight. Sharpe was mud and gunpowder, and men dying badly in foreign fields. It was popular, genuinely and massively popular, with audiences who came back film after film and made it one of ITV's most reliable properties. But popular and acclaimed occupied different rooms in the television establishment, and Sharpe was never quite invited through the right door. BAFTA nominations did not follow in the numbers the quality warranted. Critical attention, when it came at all, was respectful rather than passionate. The show was treated as excellent entertainment rather than important television, and that distinction carried a judgment inside it that the cast and crew felt. Bean felt it. Cornwell felt it. The kind of drama that happens outdoors, in volume, with physical rather than verbal action, was not what the gatekeepers of television prestige were primed to celebrate. Sharpe won anyway, in the way that actually matters. The audience never left. Number 17. The female characters in the early Sharpe films existed in a narrative tension that the production handled imperfectly, and that later became a source of genuine critical discomfort. The Napoleonic setting gave the writers a historical framework for limiting women's agency. but the series sometimes used that framework as permission rather than subject matter, presenting the restrictions without interrogating them and occasionally using female characters primarily as rewards or complications for Sharpe's masculine journey. Later films in the series made efforts to write women with more independence and complexity, partly in response to audience feedback and partly because the cultural conversation around this had shifted enough that the original approach had become harder to ignore. But revisiting the early films now, the imbalance is visible and uncomfortable in ways that wouldn't have registered as problems to many viewers at the time of broadcast. The series was of its era in some ways, and this is one of them. Acknowledging that doesn't diminish what it achieved, but it complicates the legacy in ways that honest reassessment requires confronting rather than smoothing over. Number 18. Bernard Cornwell watched the television adaptation of his creation with complicated feelings that he has articulated carefully over the years. Bane was not his Sharpe, not physically, not exactly. The character he had written was taller, differently built, and had been visualized a particular way across years of writing before anyone put a face to him. And yet, Cornwell has consistently and genuinely praised what Bane brought to the role, acknowledging that the actor found something in Sharpe that the page alone hadn't fully unlocked. What Cornwell has been less comfortable discussing publicly is the degree of creative control he surrendered once the adaptation process began. Television has its own logic, its own commercial pressures, and its own ideas about what a story needs. Plot elements were changed, characters were altered, chronology was rearranged to suit production practicalities. A writer who spent years building a carefully constructed fictional world watched it be efficiently reorganized for a medium that had different priorities. He remained publicly supportive throughout. What he thought privately, sitting alone with the finished films, measuring them against what lived in his own imagination, is a question only he can answer. The series returned for later installments filmed in different locations, India, Ireland, and elsewhere, as Ukraine became politically complicated and eventually inaccessible for the production's purposes. Each location change brought its own set of dark practical realities. India, in particular, presented challenges of scale and logistics that echoed the original Ukrainian experience. Vast landscapes, military cooperation requirements, heat that punished cast and crew alike, and the constant pressure of delivering something that looked expensive on a budget that wasn't. The Sharpe films set in India are visually striking and dramatically ambitious, but they were made under conditions of genuine difficulty that the finished product conceals almost entirely. Bane was older by then, the character was older, and the world around the production had changed enough that the raw, improvised quality of the early Ukrainian films was impossible to fully recreate. The later films are good, but they are good in a different way. More controlled, more aware of themselves, carrying the weight of an established legacy rather than the reckless energy of a production, inventing itself in real time in a collapsing post-Soviet landscape. The final Sharpe film aired decades after the first, and the gap between those 2 points contains a television career unlike almost any other in British drama. 16 films, multiple countries, one lad actor who kept returning to a character that the industry never fully celebrated and the audience never abandoned. The darkness at the heart of Sharpe's story, that a man can be brilliant, brave, and absolutely indispensable and still be denied the recognition that lesser men with better connections receive automatically, turned out to be not just a Napoleonic-era observation, but a description of the series itself. Sharpe deserved more than it got from the establishment. It got everything from the people who actually watched it. And in the end, that equation is the most Sharpe thing about the whole story. The character who rose from nothing without permission or pedigree, building something real in conditions that were supposed to make it impossible, mirrored the production that created him with an accuracy that nobody planned and everyone eventually felt. Sean Bean flew to Ukraine as a replacement for an injured man and came home with the defining role of his career. That is not a tidy story. It's a Sharpe story. The rifles carried by Bean and the Chosen Men were not simple props. The Baker rifle, Sharpe's signature weapon, was a real historical firearm of considerable complexity, and the production sourced working reproductions for authenticity. During one early filming day in Ukraine, A misfire during a battle sequence sent crew members diving for cover before anyone confirmed it was accidental. Nobody was hurt. The production didn't stop. Bean reportedly picked up the sequence without breaking character, which the director kept in the final cut because it was simply the best take available. The rifles that were supposed to represent military precision in a disciplined rifle corps became on a chaotic post-Soviet location with military extras and overstretched crew. Genuine variables in an already unpredictable environment. Sharpe's whole identity is built on the Baker rifle, on skill and accuracy cutting through the blunt mass of conventional warfare. The fact that the weapons themselves occasionally refused to cooperate felt, to everyone present, like exactly the kind of joke history likes to play. The show survived it, as it survived everything else, through obstinacy and luck in roughly equal measure.